Hello and welcome to the continuation of the RAGS tutorials. Today we're talking about the timers in RAGS. You can use those to make your game more fun and interactive, and some other things you can do with timers, such as grouping together a bunch of functions that will be called from multiple objects. So let's go ahead and get started. If you've been following along, you'll see that these are this is the game file that we've been working with. We've got our green sea turtles and our rooms, if you remember. And we've created some variables, including our JavaScript functions. Let's go ahead and look at timers, though, and see what those do for us. A timer essentially is standard timers that are not live timers that we'll talk about. Essentially occur each turn, and different things can happen depending on what turn we're at and those sorts of things. Let me briefly explain everything you're looking at here on the Timers tab. So first you'll click Timers at the bottom. And you'll see here under Timers we'll have a list of our timers. This execution order is important for normal timers because they run according to their execution order. So execution order 1 will run first, 2 will run second, and those sorts of things. This is important because often people will accidentally overwrite the same variable multiple times, and based on the execution order, whatever ran last is what they're left with. This could cause some interesting problems and difficulties debugging at times, but we'll talk about that later. Let's look here. Execution order. You can actually change the execution order of your timers after you create them. So if you want one to run before the other, you just highlight it and change it here. Let's go ahead and add a timer so some more stuff is highlighted here. So we'll give it a name here. Our first timer. And you'll see it has execution order 1. Our second timer. Our second timer has execution order 2. So if we wanted that to run first, we can just select that, and look, our orders have swapped. And put that back to 1 if you want. Okay, so let's look at our first timer again. A timer type. This means, does this timer always run, or does it run a specified length? For example, if you wanted a 10-turn timer, you'd tell it, I don't want it to run all the time, I just want it to run for 10 turns. So you select run a specified length, and then your timer detail becomes enabled. You can specify 10 turns. If you want it to loop after it reaches the end of 10 turns, it can do that. Or if you want it to run 10 times and then end, you can leave this. So that's what your restart automatically will do. Live timers are something new to the later versions of RAGS. It actually lets a timer run independently in your game. So it's not related to your player taking any turns in your game. And I'm going to show you those in a minute, but let's start with a basic timer that runs for 10 turns and what that does for us. Once again, you have custom properties. This should be pretty familiar to you. So if you wanted to, for example, have times run property, and we'll start it at 0, you can do that. So this is pretty familiar to you, I'm sure. Let's look at our actions now. The actions are different based on whether you choose to have a timer run a specified length of time or run always, or live timers. So let's look. We told it to do 10 turns. Now if you right click and you say add action, RAGS will automatically give you a list of valid events. So you can do on turn 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or and on last turn, which in this case is the same as on turn 10. So let's do something on turn 5. Say, let's just make it display some text here and say, you've reached our first timer, turn 5. Okay, great. So when we reach turn 5, we'll display this message. On each turn, we can also display a little message. Let's do that. So we'll say our first timer running. There we go. So if we were to run our game now, this timer would do nothing essentially because it's not initially active. Let's go ahead and make it so our player can turn on this timer by themselves. So we've got all these little kind of test commands. Let's go ahead and add another action. Turn on timer. So I probably didn't need that period there. If you screw up, you can rename your actions. Turn on, did I spell that right? Turn on timer. Okay. So all this will do is turn on our timer. So let's find that command in here. Should be under timers. Here we go. Set timer to active or inactive. We want our first timer to become active when we do that. So let's go ahead and see what happens here. Where's our debug? There we go. So we're going to debug our game. We're going to minimize our debug window here. I'm going to make this reasonable size. Okay. So here you remember our wonderful game. If we examine ourselves, we don't see anything exciting here. So let's go ahead and turn on the timer. Here we go. So now you'll see our first timer running. Let's pull up our debug data form. If you look here under execution data, you'll see our first timer active executing, and the timer displayed our first timer ran, and it ran the on each turn event, and it executed that, which displays our text. So let's go ahead and let's just wait around here. So each turn we take, our timer is still running. You'll see our first timer is running. First timer's running. There we go. Now this is something different. Our first timer running, but now you'll see you've reached our first turn 5. So let's look at the debug data form to see what happened here. So when you look at timer, our first timer is executing. You'll see it did our first timer, here we go, on each turn ran, and then on turn 5 ran. So you can have multiple events happening at one time here. So let's go ahead and examine it out until we reach turn 10. Our timer should stop. There we go. Our timer just shut off. It ran 10 turns. Now it's done. So what you'll notice is you have to perform an action which takes a game turn before anything happens. So that's how our first timer works. Let's go ahead and look at our second timer. What we're going to do here is we'll have it actually be a live timer. So when you have a live timer, it can't run a specified length. Rags will yell at you. Live timers must be set to run always, because turns really don't mean anything when it's a live timer. So let's go ahead and make it a live timer. Live timers must be set to run always. Yes. Now, seconds to fire. How many seconds should we wait before our timer goes off? Let's go ahead and set it to maybe 5 seconds. Now let's go ahead and look at our actions. The only action you'll have available is on each turn. That's actually meaningful. If you try to add actions, there's no more available actions for a timer set to run always. So let's go ahead and look at our on each turn. So there's going to be no concept of turns here. What we're going to do is every 5 seconds we're going to display a message. Our second timer is firing at 5 seconds. There we go. Let's go ahead and run this. Well, we also have to turn this one on as well. Let's go ahead and make that initially active so we don't have to do anything. Let's go ahead and debug it and run it. We'll shrink that down. I'll pull this up here. There we go. Our second timer is firing at 5 seconds. So if we wait another 5 seconds, we haven't done anything. It's firing again. So there's our timer. We can go ahead and turn on timer 1. This timer is of course tied to turns, so it won't do anything until we actually take some turns. So we can see our second timer's running, our first timer's running. There we go. So we've reached turn 5. Our second timer, since it's a live action, will run independent of the player doing anything. That can be very, very useful in certain games, certain complex things you're trying to accomplish. Let's go ahead and look at our debug data form here. You will see, well, it's kind of the same message. It's hard to tell it's changing. Let's go ahead and do that. Every 5 seconds, boop, we get our second timer on each turn firing. So we'll keep doing this as long as we let our game run. This particular timer isn't very useful, but we can do very useful things with this, such as make our characters walk around by themselves, and I'll show you how to do that in one of the advanced tutorials after we get done. So let's see, that is basically it. Let's go ahead and we'll turn that guy off. Let's go back to our first timer. Oops. Got a little confused there. Okay. So let's go back here. We'll tell this guy to run always. Turn 5 won't actually be executed anymore. What we could do is use our custom properties here. Times run, we're going to increase that each time this executes. So we're going to go to timer, set custom property. We're going to do our first timer times run, add 1. I don't know if that will work actually. Let's give that a try. What we're going to do here then, swap the order here. I'm going to display our custom property in our timer. Do that with this Alt-V menu. We'll pull that up. We'll go to timer properties, our first timer times run. So let's see if that actually works or not. We may have to do something a little fancier. Let's go ahead and give it a try. Debug. Okay. Let's go ahead and start the timer. There we go. Times run 1, that's good. Times run 2, okay. It's working great. Time run 3, okay. So that's one way that you can modify it so that each time you run, the timer isn't running your turns. It will never end, essentially, unless you do it in your code. So that's basically all there is to timers. One way people will use timers often is to group a bunch of functions together. So, for example, if we don't want our timer to run, we just want to group all of our functions together under on each turn that we want to execute. We can go into our beginning room, for example. And each time I examine, we can actually execute all of the functions that are grouped together in the on each turn commands on success. So let's go ahead and try that. So instead of examine, it's going to do all of this, but we're going to add one more function. Each time they examine, we're going to execute the timer. So we're essentially treating the timer as a function call. And here's the command you use, timer, execute timer. So we want to run our first timer. So this is a way to group everything together and call it from different objects, different rooms, whatever you need, you can group them together this way. So let's go ahead and debug it. So keep in mind, our timer is not active. So if we do a search, we don't get any timer messages, but when we do our exam and we execute the timer, here we go. Now our timer's still not running. If we examine, we don't see our first timer running, because it's not. It's actually being called like a function. So all of the RAGS commands and conditions that you want to check are grouped together under that. So each time we examine, we call it. So that's a way to group a bunch of RAGS functions together. The other way, of course, is to use some JavaScript, which I've already shown you under variables, how the JavaScript works. You can create JavaScript functions in the variable objects themselves. You can also, within your timers, execute JavaScript functions as well. So it's very flexible, easy to use. That's pretty much all I wanted to cover with timers. They're relatively easy to understand, and hopefully you can find a good use for them in your game. Thanks, and we'll talk to you soon.